The end of World War II in May 1945 did not mark the end of the complex, strategic interests surrounding Germany's military research establishments. The fall of the Nazi regime left a sprawling network of laboratories, factories, and research facilities scattered across Germany, each playing a key role in the development of advanced military technologies during the war. Yet, as the war came to a close and Germany's defeat became a certainty, these laboratories, once at the cutting edge of innovation, suddenly became surplus to requirements. The question now was, what to do with them? The sheer scale of this question was staggering. Over 2,000 different military research facilities had been directly or indirectly associated with the Third Reich's war effort. From aerodynamics research to advanced rocket science, from nuclear experiments to radar technology, these laboratories had been pivotal in advancing German military capabilities. But now, they were on the wrong side of history. In the face of military defeat and economic collapse, these installations no longer served any immediate purpose for the new post-war order. Many were heavily damaged by Allied bombing campaigns, while others were abandoned altogether as the Germans fled westward to escape advancing Soviet forces. The physical state of the labs varied dramatically. Some stood as near ruins, while others were well preserved, filled with cutting-edge technology that would soon become a point of intense interest for the victorious Allies. Yet it wasn't just the physical structures that needed consideration, it was what they contained. Among the scattered remnants of broken war machinery and old plans lay a treasure trove of research that had the potential to reshape the future of global warfare. The Allies were keenly aware of this and moved swiftly to secure any technologies that could give them an advantage. The most notable of these efforts were carried out by two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, both eager to seize the technological lead, particularly in areas like rocket development and nuclear science. The United States, under the Operation Paperclip program, moved to secure the services of the very scientists who had developed the Nazi military technologies. Some of these scientists were relocated to the United States, where they would continue their research under new auspices. Wernher von Braun, perhaps the most famous of these scientists, was one of the key figures in this program. Having been responsible for developing the V-2 rocket, von Braun's expertise would eventually help lay the foundations for the U.S. space program. Yet even as the Americans secured the expertise of these scientists, they found themselves confronted with the question of what to do with the infrastructure they had inherited. The Soviets, too, were in pursuit of the secrets hidden within Germany's military research. Under the guise of reparations, the Soviet Union moved to systematically dismantle the facilities and transport both scientists and equipment back to the USSR. While the Americans focused on individual expertise, the Soviets sought to systematically strip Germany's research centers, disassembling the equipment and carting it off to the east. By the end of 1946, Soviet teams had disassembled entire laboratories, sending everything from radar components to experimental aircraft to Soviet factories for reconstruction. As the Soviet Union sought to rebuild its own military capabilities, the value of the technology gleaned from these German installations was immeasurable. Meanwhile, on the ground in Germany itself, the fate of these research facilities was less grandiose and more immediate. With the country in ruins, the German people and local officials were left to figure out what to do with the remnants of their former scientific prowess. Many of the facilities were left abandoned, their workers either dead, imprisoned, or dispersed across Europe. In some cases, the laboratories were repurposed for civilian uses. For instance, the former Peenemünde Army Research Center, once the birthplace of the V-2 rocket, was transformed into a Soviet base of operations. The center's infrastructure was reassembled, but now for Soviet military needs, continuing the research started by its German predecessors. In other cases, scientists and engineers were offered opportunities to work in non-military capacities for the new West German government, which was desperate to rebuild the country's shattered economy. However, this did not provide any clear path for the vast majority of these research centers. The economic pressures in post-war Germany added yet another layer of complexity. The country was broken into 4 zones of occupation, each under the control of either the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, or France. The financial resources to maintain such expansive research infrastructure were non-existent, and the task of dismantling or repurposing these facilities fell largely to the occupying powers. With industry in ruins, much of the equipment was either scrapped for raw materials or left to deteriorate. The cost of preserving or rebuilding these facilities was far too high for a nation struggling to feed its population and rebuild its cities. Some of the laboratories that had been at the forefront of weapon development were left to fall into disrepair, abandoned by both the Germans and their new occupiers. As the Allies worked to denazify Germany, they also had to contend with the challenge of determining what was worth keeping. The V-2 rocket program, which had been one of the most technologically advanced projects of the war, was no longer viewed through the lens of military conquest. The new priority was to ensure that these technologies did not fall into the wrong hands. The V-2's advanced propulsion systems were of particular interest, but there was little reason to keep the physical infrastructure that had once been responsible for building them. Peenemünde, once a nerve center for the Nazi war effort, was increasingly seen as an unsustainable relic. The Soviet Union quickly transformed the facility into a site for their own missile program, while the Americans and British dismantled and carted away equipment to their own countries. The work done at Peenemünde would continue to live on, but not in the way its German creators had intended. At the same time, much of the scientific research done in these laboratories was not purely military in focus. Many of the breakthroughs, particularly in physics and engineering, were far-reaching in their potential applications. The problem, however, was that these applications were not immediately relevant to the rebuilding of Europe or to the geopolitical needs of the post-war world. The war itself had dramatically altered the scientific landscape. New priorities had emerged in both the United States and the Soviet Union, shifting focus toward nuclear weapons development, space exploration, and even the emerging field of computer science. The economic pressures that drove the Allies' actions also played a role in relegating some of the research to irrelevance. As the US and Soviet Union scrambled to secure whatever technologies they could, many other advancements, while promising, were abandoned or ignored. In the years immediately following the war, the fate of Germany's military research establishments remained uncertain. The conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union was already beginning to take shape, and with it, the need for secrecy and technological dominance. Many of the scientists who had been involved in the development of Germany's weapons programs found themselves thrust into entirely different roles. Their expertise was now an asset that both superpowers coveted, but they were no longer working within the same institutions nor with the same goals. The labs, once buzzing with activity, had become abandoned sites, symbols of a regime that had been undone by its own hubris. The physical structures would stand for years, often hidden in plain sight, as the larger world began to rebuild itself in the shadow of a conflict that would shape the next several decades. The transition of these laboratories from symbols of Nazi ambition to objects of geopolitical competition marked only the beginning of their post-war journey. The full extent of their fate would not become clear until the final years of the 1940s, as the world began to realign itself in the aftermath of a war that had transformed everything. But by then, much of the key technology and expertise that had once been central to Germany's war effort had already begun to be dispersed, dismantled, and repurposed. And the research facilities themselves, now a mere shadow of their former selves, would continue to stand as silent witnesses to the fallout of a war whose consequences had only just begun to unfold. The fate of Germany's military research laboratories after the war, as the 1940s wore on, would become a complex interplay of political power plays, scientific advancements, and the emerging Cold War tensions between East and West. The destruction and dismantling of these facilities were far from a simple matter. What had once been a network of state-of-the-art laboratories, filled with engineers and scientists working toward military goals, now found themselves either caught in a web of competing national interests or left to decay under the weight of war and the economic pressures of post-war Europe. In the immediate aftermath of the war, both the Soviet Union and the United States had one clear goal: to prevent the technology within these German research facilities from falling into the hands of the other. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, had long seen the development of advanced technology as central to its goal of challenging the United States. In contrast, the Americans, under President Harry S. Truman, were equally determined to secure the scientific knowledge of the defeated Germans, knowing full well that the next phase of global power would hinge on technological superiority. This race to acquire the technological spoils of war would define the post-war fate of many of Germany's military research centers. The Soviet Union's approach was systematic and brutal. In the early months of post-war Germany, Soviet teams were dispatched across the country to strip the research facilities bare. The Soviet Union sought not only the equipment but also the scientists who could unlock the secrets of German innovation. Many of the leading figures in Nazi-era technology, including former Luftwaffe scientists and engineers, were abducted or coerced into relocation. The Soviets took particular interest in Germany's rocket technology, which had reached unprecedented levels of sophistication with the V-2 rocket program. The Soviet Union quickly began a large-scale effort to replicate these systems, integrating the expertise of the scientists it had captured into their own military-industrial complex. The most significant of these efforts occurred at the Peenemünde Army Research Center, the birthplace of the V-2 rocket. The site, located on the Baltic coast, was heavily bombed during the war, but its technological legacy was undeniable. The Soviet Union, recognizing its potential, swiftly took control of what remained, dismantling much of the equipment and sending it back to the USSR. It was not just the rockets themselves that were of interest, but the advanced knowledge and skills behind them. Over the course of the next few years, Soviet engineers would continue work on the technology originally developed at Peenemünde, with key components of the German V-2 rockets integrated into the Soviet Union's own missile program. This would lead to the development of their own ballistic missiles, which would later play a pivotal role in the Cold War arms race. However, the Soviet Union was not alone in this technological scavenging. The United States, fearing that the Soviets would gain an upper hand, began its own program to acquire German expertise. Operation Paperclip was established to bring prominent German scientists to the United States, offering them new opportunities in exchange for their expertise. This program, though controversial in later years, was instrumental in shaping U.S. military and space programs. Among the most notable figures was Wernher von Braun, who had been a central figure in the development of the V-2 rocket. Von Braun's transition from Nazi scientist to American military and space program figure is perhaps one of the most symbolic examples of the post-war reorientation of Germany's wartime technologies. Von Braun, along with a number of his colleagues, was transported to the United States in 1945. Within months, he was leading American efforts to develop ballistic missiles. By the early 1950s, von Braun and his team would be instrumental in the development of the Redstone and Jupiter missiles, which were key components of America's early missile defense program. These missiles would eventually lay the foundation for the U.S. space program. Von Braun's leadership in the development of the Saturn V rocket would be instrumental in landing a man on the moon in 1969. The transformation of the V-2 rocket from a Nazi weapon into a key part of the U.S. space program was emblematic of how Germany's wartime research would be repurposed by its former enemies. At the same time, many of the research centers in the American and British zones of occupation were left to deteriorate. With limited resources and the need to focus on rebuilding the country's economy, the occupying powers did not have the capacity to sustain or repurpose all of Germany's military infrastructure. In many cases, the facilities simply fell into ruin, their equipment either looted or scrapped for materials. Some of these sites, like the Mittelwerk V-2 production facility in the Harz Mountains, were left abandoned. The facility, once home to thousands of slave laborers, was an eerie testament to the horrors of the Third Reich. By the late 1940s, it had been stripped of all valuable materials, and the remnants of the labor camps were left largely untouched, hidden away in the dense forests of central Germany. The economic devastation of Germany in the years following the war also meant that there was little chance of rebuilding many of these facilities. The German economy was in ruins, and the country's industrial base had been heavily targeted during Allied bombing campaigns. While some laboratories were repurposed for civilian use, many of them faced an uncertain future. The need to feed a starving population and rebuild cities meant that military research was not a priority. The fate of these centers was largely determined by the occupying forces, who had their own agendas and interests. The Americans focused on securing high-value technologies, while the Soviets stripped down facilities for industrial purposes. Both powers were keenly aware that the future of warfare, and perhaps the future of civilization itself, would be shaped by the technologies developed during the war. However, it wasn't just the V-2 rockets that were sought after. German research into radar, jet propulsion, and even early computer science were of immense interest to both the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The Germans had developed some of the most advanced radar systems in the world, and these technologies were quickly incorporated into both countries' defense programs. The Americans, in particular, were interested in the German work on early computers, such as the Z3, a mechanical computer developed by Konrad Zuse during the war. Though not fully realized during the war, the technology behind the Z3 would influence the development of post-war computing in the West. Zuse, like von Braun, was one of the many German scientists whose work would ultimately be repurposed in the Cold War context.